disappear directly after this. There's more to come, but Paul is our final invited speaker of this year's HEIR conference. I'm Phil Gravestock. I'm Dean of the College of Learning and Teaching at the University of Wolverhampton, and I'm also a member of the HEIR planning group. Just a quick reminder that I know many of you will know this by now, but just in case you come in specially for Paul's presentation, just to say that we are recording this, and if you don't want to be sort of on the recording, just sort of turn your cameras off, etc. And particularly when it comes to questions, if you don't want to sort of be on the camera or the recording for that, just put your question in the chat. And I would encourage you to put them in the chat anyway, because it gives us an opportunity to sort of bring forward people if they want to come forward and ask the question. So please do, during the presentation, pop in anything in the chat that you think is important, that you want to ask Paul afterwards. So without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Paul Ashwin. Paul is Professor of Higher Education and Head of Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University, and he is Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, which is an ESRC-funded research centre involving 10 international universities. The title of Paul's talk today is Measuring the Quality of University Education Beyond the Nonsense of University Rankings. And as Matt mentioned earlier, there potentially might be some contradiction, discrepancy between this topic and the sort of post-conference session that we're running at 1 o'clock. So it'd be really interesting to see if there's any sort of comments and questions relating to that. And in particular, I'm very interested to see where this goes. I'm at an institution which we took ourselves out of the league tables a few years ago. So I'd be very interested to sort of see this topic. It's something close to my heart. So without further ado, please, Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no problem at all.
Okay, let me just share my slides. There we go. Okay, and can you see the slides?
We can indeed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So I'm going to talk about measuring the quality of university education. And in terms of my title and the signalling of the nonsense of university rankings, I need to be clear that what I'm saying, where the nonsense lies, is in positioning them as a measure of educational quality. They do measure some things, but what I will argue is that they don't provide a measure of educational quality, and I'll explain why. I'll probably draw in some comparisons with the TEF, and then talk about how else we might think about measuring the quality of university education. So just before we kind of get into that, the first thing I want to emphasize is the real challenge of measuring the quality of university education. But actually, it's something that's really difficult to do. And the first thing I want to signal in relation to that is that the meaning of quality changes when you're thinking about the quality of education for an individual, when you're thinking about the quality of education across an institution, and then finally, within the three I've identified here, when you're thinking about the quality of education across a system, across a higher education system. And really, in this presentation, what I'm focusing on is how we measure the quality of university education across a whole system. And when we get to the system level, and when we think about the system level, there tends to be this tension between fine-grained measurement that kind of really gives us a deep insight into the quality of education, and then kind of much higher levels. So you might think about this as a kind of shift between big data measurements that try and measure everything, and silver bullet measures where people try and focus on one measure that tells them about lots of other measures. And you can see this, for example, in the measure of quality back in the day of QAA subject review that was kind of very fine-grained and went round individual departments, and then shifting to institutional review, and a kind of tension between the two that really, if we want to know about quality, we need to be getting into departments, but that being very, very expensive and shifting back. And similarly within the TEF, a sense that, you know, it's definitely going to start at institutional level, but then we're going to get to subject level TEF, definitely going to have subject level TEF. Oh, that looks a bit expensive. We're not going to have subject level TEF. So you can see this sense of a movement. And also getting back to why it's so difficult, one of the real challenges about education is that it's a local achievement, that it's always about particular students. It's always about particular bodies of knowledge. And what we're doing educationally is we're trying to create a relationship between particular students and particular bodies of knowledge in a particular setting. And so that means that if the student changes or the knowledge changes or the setting changes, then actually what counts as high quality education, what counts as an effective way of educating changes. And so that local nature of education makes it quite difficult, quite different from research and measuring the quality of research, and makes it much more difficult to develop system-wide measures of the quality of university education. So if we want to do this, I would argue that there's two things that we need to take account of. First of all, that there's over 50 years research on the quality of education, the quality of learning and teaching in higher education. And we also need to take account of what happens when measures become performance indicators. So Goodhart's law, that the moment a measure becomes a performance indicator, it ceases to be a good measure. And if we want to develop system-wide measures, we need to take account of both of these things. We also need to recognise that measurement is incredibly expensive. So there's no point in measuring unless measurement leads to changes in practice. There's no point in measuring for measuring's sake. We want measures that actually lead to the enhancement of the education that we offer. Often people kind of say, oh, well, you know, what we do in measurement is that we work out what we value and then we work out how to measure that. But time and time again, it's shown to move in the different direction. So that when people work out a rough proxy of what they value, actually what turns out to be valued is the thing they've measured. And we see this in the assessment of students, we see this in the assessment of institutions, we see it time and time again. So what we end up choosing to measure has huge impact on what we value. And then finally, we need to be aware, or rather beware of false precision in this kind of areas. Sometimes people talk about measures of education or quality as if they have the precision of lasers, as if we can measure things to kind of a couple of decimal points and that's meaningful. And the kind of move to big data and learning analytics hasn't helped with this. The sense that we're dealing with very, very fine measurements, and we're not. Within this space, the kind of measures we have the precision of sledgehammers. They don't have the precision of lasers. So this kind of thinking about these things would lead me to argue for 7 key characteristics of valid measures of educational quality. So first of all, they need to reflect the purposes of higher education. There's no point in measuring something that isn't actually related to what we're trying to achieve. Secondly, they need to examine the quality of a particular degree rather than an institution. And this is because we know, and the evidence tells us, that the quality of education is at the level of a particular course. We know that within institutions, they have a mixture of some courses that are very good and some courses that are much less good. So when we measure at institutional level, we're not really measuring educational quality. Second, actually, the measures we use need to be focused on the quality of education rather than reputation or prestige. And many of the measures that are purported to measure educational quality, when you look at them carefully, they're actually more a measure of reputation, prestige and history than they are of educational quality. We also want, under 4, a variety of measures that tell us about quality. We want to see quality from different perspectives when we think about it, but we need, under 5, for these things to be brought together as a whole and based on a coherent, research-informed vision of the educational process. We need to know why it relates to what was said in the previous session about theories of change and thinking about why we expect things to lead to a change. Similarly, we need to have a view of the educational process on how that informs the way that we think about quality. 6th, and really importantly, any measures that we have of quality if they're going to be valid measures, then the only way to improve your position on these measures should be improving the quality of what you do. If not, then you'll end up with plenty of institutional gaming. And then the final one is that these measures provide a relatively simple comparison of educational quality. And that use of the word relatively is really important there, as I'll come on to say, in terms of, you know, sometimes simplicity can be beguiling, but actually incredibly misleading. Which brings us nicely on to commercial university rankings. And I deliberately use the word commercial here because it's really important to understand that these university rankings are not done out of the goodness of these organisations' heart. They're done for commercial reasons. And, you know, it's really important to acknowledge how attractive they are to people as measures of educational quality. They travel across a number of contexts and audiences. People know what they mean. You know, so there's something very attractive about them as measures of educational quality. However, unfortunately, they tend to involve unrelated and incomparable measures that tell us very little about educational quality. So you tend to get your kind of different measures, whether it's entry grades, career prospects, some aspects of student experiences that are brought together and, you know, these different kinds of measures without a sense of what actually is the whole they're speaking towards. As I'm sure you're all aware, differences of many places are largely meaningless. You know, it's a simple ranking, but there's nothing that tells you what the difference between being placed first or 10th or 150th actually means. And they tend to be incredibly stable over time. And because of the measures that they include, because lots of their measures tend to be focused on institutional prestige, so measures such as expenditure, measures such as staff-student ratio, measures such as entry requirements tend to give you a sense of the prestige and history of an institution rather than as educational quality. And they also, so they privilege higher status institutions, and these higher education institutions, as we know, enroll a much greater proportion of privileged students. So what they do as a whole is they tend to encourage us to mistake institutional prestige for quality in institutions, and they encourage us to mistake privilege for ability in students. And finally, what's absolutely crucial to understand is the purpose of commercial university rankings is to sell things. Its primary purpose are not to measure. So they're used to sell advertising, they're used to sell consultancy. And it's really important that we bear that in mind when we engage with them so that we understand actually what they're trying to achieve. So if we relate these kind of university rankings to the 7 measures that I identified before, we can see that they kind of don't do particularly well. They don't reflect the purposes of higher education. When they're at a subject level, they kind of do give a sense of a particular degree, but you know, they don't measure the quality of education offered. So overall, we can see that kind of 3 out of the 7 they achieve, which isn't particularly great as a measure of education quality. Just as an aside, it's not particularly great, but it is better than the TEF as a measure of educational quality. So you know, whilst there is a nonsense of university rankings within the TEF, there's not something there for reasons that I don't have time to go into now that actually could replace university rankings. So if we want to think about an alternative, then one of the things that both the TEF and university rankings struggle with is this idea of the purposes of higher education. And that's where I'd start in thinking about how we can develop alternative ways of measuring the quality of university education across the system. And so if we think about the purposes of higher education, I would argue that a high quality education is one that's about designing ways in which particular students can develop an understanding of particular bodies of disciplinary and or professional knowledge. And then what happens in that education is that students come into relationship to that knowledge and they change their sense of who they are. They change their sense of what they can do in the world based on their engagement with that knowledge. And that changes their sense of who they are and changes their sense of what they can do in the world. And that's what I would argue that the education that universities offer is intended to achieve. And so if we're going to have measures of educational quality, then it needs to be focused on that process. So this kind of gives a sense of how I would understand the transformational power of higher education. It's about students coming in to relationship to collective bodies of knowledge, and then that changing how they can think about the world. So briefly, here's a kind of quote from a student from a project we recently did talking about chemistry and about saying how the student who we've given the pseudonym Donners to kind of study of chemistry has helped her to have a sense of a theory of how things are working from the perspective of chemistry. So she talks about the science element kind of going off in her brain and seeing things in the way that a chemist would see it. And that sense of how do we understand the different ways in which different programs enable students to see the world differently and see the world in a way that's informed and mediated by the knowledge that they study through higher education. So this would give an alternative way of thinking about how we measure the educational quality offered by higher education institutions. It would raise questions around, well, how do institutions ensure their degree programs are well designed and based on evidence-informed views of who their students are, how and why the knowledge they offer students is important and powerful, how it enables students to understand and change the world, and who does it allow students to become through their engagement with the knowledge. Yes, including what jobs they do, but more widely, how does that help them to contribute to society? And so my argument would be that if we take something like this as a model, then we can think about a range of metrics that tell us about students' experiences on these programs and how they're changed by their engagement in these programs. And that might be one part of the assessment, but equally another part of the assessment would be, well, how do institutions use their performance on metrics to improve what they're doing? And I think one of the key things that gets us to measures of educational quality that lead to enhancement is to ask institutions to talk about how they use the evidence they gather to improve what they're doing, how they use metrics to actually lead to improvement rather than simply focusing on the metrics themselves. So I would argue that this way of thinking about measuring educational quality meets more of the kind of criteria that I outlined at the beginning. The one under question is, well, would it provide a relatively simple comparison of quality? And that's really the kind of difficult question, because as I said at the beginning, kind of relatively simple measures of quality are beguiling, but they might mislead more than they inform. So that sense of how much tolerance is there for complexity in measures and actually talking about how we measure educational quality and why it might not be as simple as is presented as a ranking is something that we need to struggle with. And so where I would conclude is that we actually need to argue for and develop measures of educational quality that actually reflect what a university education is trying to achieve. It's really important that we're measured on actually what our education is trying to do rather than other measures. And a key responsibility for universities and for higher education institutions is to be stewards of knowledge for society, making that knowledge available to society. But that gives us particular duties. We shouldn't, given our stewardship of knowledge, be highlighting measures of our performance that we know are nonsense. And so one of my really big problems with university rankings is the ways in which universities use them, the ways in which universities engage in doublespeak, They know that rankings are nonsense, but when they do well, they trumpet their success in them. And for me, that is a dereliction of the duty of universities and higher education institutions to be stewards of knowledge. When we pretend that something that we know is meaningless as a measure of educational quality says something meaningful. And so I would finish by saying that we need an honest conversation about the potential and the limits of a university education. So we don't try and always overclaim. We don't use measures that we know are meaningless as if they're meaningful, and that we really think about how we develop an education that allows the system of higher education to be inclusive and transformative rather than elite and reproductive. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful, Paul. Thank you ever so much. And I think that's there are just a couple of comments which we'll come to in a second, but I think that's really interesting about the purpose of higher education. And I'm just thinking about the sort of the organisation where I work. It's really important. We feel we're making the changes for the students, and the sort of terminology that's used. So something like a first and 2-1 is a good degree. The implication that if students don't get that, they haven't got a good degree. Yet for some students, a 2-2 or third or going to university is a huge achievement in itself, and I think it's really important to say that we bear that in mind and think about what it is we're trying to do to help those students to make the difference. And if they go back into the community with their 2-2, with their third, whatever it is, but a difference is made, then surely that's part of what we've been trying to do. So I think that's really important. I'll just go. So Anna was making a point about the educational gain element of TEF. I know Claire's followed up on this because it seems we've almost ignored the work that went on with learning gain that was done with all the HEFKI projects a few years ago. I'm conscious that I remember at one conference it was there were 13 projects and 13 definitions of learning gain. That might be part of it, but I sort of be interested to take your view on whether that might be helpful in because it's now up to institutions to sort of define what we mean by that. So
yeah,
an opportunity for us.
I think individual institutions could use it as an opportunity. I think the mistake would be to suddenly charge out and generating your own data about learning gain. What I would do is to look at what evidence is available already, kind of in terms of incoming students, in terms of graduate outcomes, and think about, well, how can we use that data as a way of giving an account of learning gain, but also to position institutional enhancement. I think for an institutional level, what's important is that you don't just do things for the TEF. What you do is you think about how are we enhancing our education and how can we marry that with the opportunity of what's going on with learning gain. So I think at the level of individual institutions, there's an opportunity there. At the level of a system, I think it's kind of more problematic. And just coming back to your kind of earlier comments, Phil, about relationship to society, I think that's kind of really crucial in thinking about that, is that too often higher education positions itself as if it's separate from society, rather than really thinking about the way in which we engage with communities, the way in which how we prepare students to do things in those communities and how we support them afterwards. And the problem with that is it then allows other stakeholders to say to us, because we separate ourselves as separate from society, okay, well, it's fair enough for us to measure how much your graduates earn, even though that's not under your control. It's fair enough for us to make you completely responsible for student mental health, even though that's more a reflection of what's going on in society than it is about what's going into education. So the more we separate universities from societies, the more we end up appearing to be responsible for things that actually aren't under the control of higher education institutions.
No, I think that's really important. I'm just wondering if Anna or Claire would like to sort of come in on any of the points we're making about the sort of the educational gain or those parts of the TEF at all. We may have covered it, Anna and Claire, you might be fine. That's okay. Matt, you've got your hand up. Is that for a question, Matt?
Yes, I'm aware that we're almost out of time. So I'd like to come back on a few points now, and then maybe we could cover it more later this afternoon. So you might be surprised, or you might not be, that I actually agree with most of the points you made. I've done a screenshot of your 7 points. We do try to reflect the purposes of higher education, as I'll explain later on. We try to work through the student life cycle and have a proxy measure for each stage of that. And none of them are perfect, but they do seek to approximate the different parts of the educational experience. We do operate at the subject level. I think we do that more than the other domestic rankings. And I would argue that we are, well, no, hang on, this is my main point, so I don't want to contradict you here. We're not about quality, we're not even about performance, we're about approximate suitability for a generic student using the guide. And we don't know exactly who that student is. They might be, getting the grades to go to a top institution, or they might be considering whether higher education is for them at all. And we have to produce one guide that's not tailored to them. So we're trying to cater to them. I'll go into it later on. I don't think there's time now, but I sort of agree with you. I think we do more to avoid being about prestige than the other ones do by our rejection of the research metrics. Yes, different perspectives cover. I suppose the one that I didn't feel was that about the commercial push behind a university guide. I mean, yes, of course, the Guardian's a commercial organisation, but we're not selling consultancy. There's some advertising, but I think it's akin to how the Guardian do investigative journalism. It's not. It costs them a lot, but it's part of their broader mission, and their mission has a business model. Of course, it does, but it's not money making. They're never trying to influence me, saying we want you to shake things up at the top so that we can sell a few papers. It's yeah, they're not like that. They want something credible and useful that will keep people committed to their brand. And as for stability, for us, it's a challenge. We try to maintain stability as much as we can. We intervene in the data that we receive each year to try and make sure that things aren't, that the messages we're giving prospective students aren't jumping all over the place from one year to the next. Because if they are, we kind of have to acknowledge that we were wrong last year or are wrong this year. We're out of time, but I'd love to continue this conversation a bit.
Can I just respond? I realise we're out of time, but just to respond. So clearly, my biggest gripe is with the university's use of rankings rather than rankings themselves. The rankings do what they do, and I would say that you're responding as if I was talking directly about the Guardian ranking, and I'm talking about a lot of them. And if you look at, for example, the way in which Times Higher use their global rankings, it is about selling consultancy. They even offer consultancy to institutions about how to improve their ranking. It's a completely business model. So that does vary between different rankings. And as you say, the issue is that if people see them as a measure of educational quality when they're not, that's problematic. But there are also challenges for the Guardian. The fact that they had Oxford and Cambridge as the top 2 institutions where they were non-applicable for NSS kind of is a really damaging thing, because because had it been, for example, I don't know, Wolverhampton, you don't imagine they would have been included in the same way. And so you get that sense of there's a kind of sense of, for the Guardian, they need Oxford and Cambridge in there, otherwise their ranking isn't credible. And in the early days, William Locke and colleagues did a really interesting kind of set of interviews with people who compiled rankings, in which they kind of said, in a way they would never say now, oh no, we don't just look at the data, we also think about which are the good institutions and make sure that actually what we've got makes sense. And that's the thing, is that unless your ranking matches people's preconceived ideas about what a good university is, people will reject your ranking. And so as a ranking, you have to take that into account, but that for the person who's using it for education quality is a problem. So it really was about, don't see them as a measure of education quality. As you say, there's other ways of seeing them. But as I've said, the real issue is the way universities use that as if it's a way of trumpeting their quality. That to me is where the shame lies. There's no, for people who compile rankings, they compile rankings. Universities have a choice about how they engage with that. And at the moment, they basically engage in doublespeak, where they kind of accept they're not measures of educational quality until they do well, and then they suddenly are.
I'm going to pause it there. I'm conscious that I'm going to stop Matt, which is unusual. I'm going to give it a go, but I'm going to stop Matt because I'm very conscious that Matt's probably done a lovely introduction to his own session at 1 o'clock. So please do come along if you want to hear more. Paul, I think this could go on for a lot longer, actually. I think there's some really important things there. And I think one thing I'd just like to sort of think about in myself is actually, I agree with so much you say, but actually, how do students and potential students, potential parents see these? That for me is part of that concern. We may understand them, but actually when they're looking at them and choosing, they may not understand all the nuances that you've just been describing so beautifully. So thank you very much indeed for that, Paul. That sort of resonates very well. So thank you very much indeed. And I would like to pass over to Rachel for the next